Good morning. My name is John Powell, and I'm here with Aaron Wright of A. Wright Landscapes, and we're going to talk a little bit about Japanese maple care. This is a very common landscape tree in this part of the country, and thrives really well and grows extremely quickly. So while it'd be ideal just to plant these things and let them go, oftentimes we can't do that, and we need to do some work to stimulate both their shape but also their growth. I guess it's important to understand what kind of Japanese maple you have in the beginning. If it's an upright maple like this, it is a medium-sized tree that can reach anywhere up to 25, 30. We have some 60, 70-year-old maples here that are probably pushing 40 feet tall. But different cultivars of Japanese maples grow to different sizes. We also have a genetically weeping set of cultivars that has a slightly different care. As far as Japanese maples go in the garden context, and especially in the Garden of the Pine Wind, our Japanese garden here at Garvin Woodland Gardens, we like a very natural shape to these trees. And when I say natural, it doesn't mean unpruned though. Here behind us is likely a bloodgood maple or potentially an Emperor One cultivar. This is the basic Acer palmatum, which is the genus and species of the Japanese maple, but with this named cultivar of bloodgood, which its main characteristic is that its leaves are red from spring until fall. The original species, Japanese maple, has green leaves though, and we have quite a few of those here inside of the garden. Certainly the fall is the main time for the Japanese maple, and when it gets the right conditions, the right amount of sun, the right amount of moisture, its fall show is pretty outstanding. Although its really interesting leaf has made it a really popular tree in the landscape. And then again, having a red cultivar like this often adds a splash of color to an often just green landscape. So you can see this tree has a lot of things going on. It's growing very fast. It's probably, this one's still a baby, probably under, I don't know, 10 years old from seedling point to where it is right now. But it's trying to do a lot of things in a lot of places. Everybody wants to sort of be the leader, so we have a lot of branches that are reaching up to the sun that are competing with each other. We also had a situation where we probably had some cold weather a little bit early, and it froze the leaves onto the tree before they were naturally able to drop off. Pretty much all trees have a little layer of tissue where they're connected to the branch called an abscission layer. In a tree like a maple, typically when the fall comes and the light reduces, the keratin or the chlorophylls in the leaf, the green part of the leaf, begin to degrade and turn into a different type of plant hormone called a keratin. But when we get a zap of cold, this abscission layer, that process of degradation, desiccation stops. And so that's why these leaves are stuck on the tree. So they're a little bit unsightly. So typically, when we do our work in the garden, we'll actually strip these leaves off. You don't have to. And your tree is not suffering because they didn't fall off. The new buds in the spring will actually push those old leaves off. What you want to watch out for is them getting dry in the summertime and turning brown and crispy. The same situation will happen, although at that time of year, because it's still warm and we have longer days, it's going to try and re-leaf again, which essentially weakens the tree. It's very important with maples just to, they don't really require an incredible amount of water, but they need to be consistently moist. And if you ever see a Japanese maple begin to wilt, you really do need to get some water to it. Now, often the lack of water and too much water show the same characteristics, so you might consider the time of day when you see that wilting. Sometimes a plant's natural defense mechanism, like a hydrangea, will kind of hunker down at the end of the day, closing its stomates inside its leaf so it doesn't lose any more through transpiration. But if we see one wilting in the morning, typically they need water. So the first thing we really do in the pruning process is look for dead branches. We take all of those out. Then, just like with most landscape trees, we're going to remove repeating, competing, crossing, and returning branches. Now, if we took all of the bad things out of the tree, we might not have anything left. So we have to sort of prioritize these things as we go. We take out the most egregious offenders first. We can always go back and do more. Years ago, there was information put out that you should never prune a tree more than 40%. That's probably a good rule of thumb, but we're often not able to follow those rules, and it's really species dependent on how we do that. We were also taught in the old days that we should do most of our work on these trees, especially the bigger cuts, during the dormant period of the year. We've actually found that that's incorrect. And then it's better to actually be pruning the trees, especially the larger cuts, while the tree is actively growing, so that it can begin either the callus or rebud process during that time. For Japanese maples, if I have the ability to do it, I like to do just a little bit at a time, almost all year round. So about 10%, 5 or 6 times a year. It allows me to groom the shape. I can make it bigger, I can make it smaller, but it allows me to sort of stage the cut so I'm not asking the tree to do too much at once. In some areas, I'll want a branch removal to callus over and not to make any more, but in other spots I may want it to break buds there. So that balance is sort of determined over time. As far as the form goes, within the Japanese garden, we often use this tree to display, again, natural, but a softer, more feminine appearance than often the way we treat the pine trees within the garden. So that said, we tend to like to have a natural sort of end here where we don't make large, what we call heading cuts that leave a wide crotch after we've removed the branch. The technique that we use in pruning pretty much for all of our trees out there is directional pruning, where we're basically going back to a branch, making a cut there in an effort to change the direction of the branch. Now, it's a little bit tricky with a Japanese maple because their branches are formed in an opposite fashion. We have 2 basic types, alternate and opposite. Other opposite branch species are ash and dogwood, two common ones. So within the pruning process, it's often hard not to make a heading cut. But unfortunately, this makes a very wide crotch here. So it can be a little bit tricky in trying to do that process, but the better cut would have been to have left that on there, but taken this one off of the top and change the direction this way. So Aaron and I will start to work on this tree a little bit, and hopefully we can clean it up. We don't have a ladder here, but thankfully we're both tall. We should be able to handle it.
Well, and the first thing to look for, as John said, is any of the dead branches. That's what we're going to go through and remove first. And I can see there's already been some improper cuts made here. This wasn't made back to a point of origin, so you've got this dead stub that just stays on the tree that's unsightly. So first of all, I'm going to go through and start taking any of the dead off, and this, you don't have to use your pruners to take the dead off. You can actually just snap this back to remove it quicker than using your pruners, because this is all just dead wood that I'm taking off to start with. But this will allow you to see the light of where the light will filter through the tree, and then we can start making our cuts on the live wood from there.
So as he's kind of cleaning up some of the interior, one of the, as we talked about before, one of the key traits of this tree is the fall color. We are often using, we like a fairly transparent tree so that we get light to penetrate into it. It also allows us to keep foliage alive on the interior here. This tree is very shade tolerant, but if this were a pine tree and we had all of this material up on top, without thinning it aggressively, we wouldn't have enough light here to sustain this, and it would begin to atrophy. We like having smaller branches throughout the entirety of the tree, and we also like interior branches. You'll often hear of a technique called lion tailing. That's where most of the interior growth is removed, and there's only growth out at the tips. We don't want to do that. But we want to thin out the tree enough so that as the leaves fall, its own leaves, and the leaves from the other trees, they're able to filter through the tree and not hang up inside of the tree. You can see all the pine needles hanging up inside. We'd like to eliminate that as much as possible. Pine needles a little bit tricky. So, yeah, a little bit of cleaning. Then you'll want to think about what size you want your tree to be. Within the landscape situation, we sort of look at the area that we have. Here, we can pretty much allow this tree to grow to its mature size. The pines up above are very tall, and there's a large distance in between these two canopies. So within the garden setting, it's really nice, especially in a distant view, for us to have something that sort of pulls that canopy down to the ground and pulls the ground up to the canopy, so to speak. So, but up within the head, we have a lot of branches that are competing to do the same thing. Maple trees are notorious for at the tips of the branches, putting a bud on top to grow up in search for the light. We prefer the look of a nice horizontal branch, so we often are removing that branch on the top in an effort to keep that whole branch essentially flat. It makes the tree look older, even when it's young, but it also allows us to keep light to these lower branch areas. If we were to allow it to continue to grow, oftentimes it will grow up over and begin to shade material out. So as I looked into the head of the tree, we've taken quite a bit of just kind of dead things out of the inside. I'm going to look for small branches on the top that are going to grow up and do exactly what I was talking about. This little branch right here is really small right now. I can just really gently break that out. So in Japan, I was taught, especially on these young branches and in very vigorous trees, that we actually pinch those out with our hands, because it will respond slightly different than cutting with the pruners. We might actually create more buds in those cut locations, especially if we were to leave a stub, as Aaron mentioned. So again, we want to try and create some flat branches across here. As I look on the inside here, I'm beginning to lose some material on the inside, but I also now have this branch that's kind of growing up and shading out over top of this other branch. So I either need to remove this or shorten it back. Unfortunately, my only option there was a heading cut, but because it's a very small one, small crotch that I left, it's not as offensive as the big wide one. But really, I want to first focus on the top of the tree. So right now there's a few branches that are just trying to take over. So in the top, I'm looking for a nice distribution, sort of an open kind of vase, I guess, almost a wine glass sort of appearance off of the main trunk or the scaffolded trunks that are inside of the tree. So I also don't want to have a really big gap where I don't have any branches. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this one in the middle. But I see that there's two pieces here that are fighting. This one's growing straight up. I'm going to go ahead and take that out in effort to let this branch behind it come in to fill some of the space. This branch, I'm not sure that I absolutely need it, but it's not hurting anything. I'm just going to change the direction so it goes out. We want branches to grow out, stick their leaves out, and become little solar panels. We don't want them particularly growing back into the inside. Here I have a small little branch. When trees are young and they're small and it's not too egregious, I'll often leave that in there. But here, I'm going to go ahead and take that one out of the top there in the hopes that I can develop this piece in the center a little bit more. In the front edge, we have a few that are just up on top of each other. Unfortunately here, we had a heading cut or a break on the lower one, and the upper one was left. We typically don't like to cut to the upper branch because it begins to change the line of that branch, making it go upwards and not sort of reclining downwards like this. We have some crossing and some rubbing happening in here. So in this case, if we're going to keep the piece back behind it, we're going to go ahead and get rid of this. And we're going to use this branch now to fill some of that space. Within here, oh, we got a lot of stuff happening. Back to that. This is a heading cut, but I don't really have a very good choice here. I'll cut back to one here and change the direction. Another reason I don't like heading cuts facing the viewer is that they can see that cut. Pruning paint, we've proven, doesn't really work. The only time we really use it is on oaks when we're worried about spread of oak wilt. But a lot of times I'll just rub a little dirt on there and nobody can tell
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, again, we got a bunch of stuff going on here. I got a crossover piece in here. What am I going to do? I could take out the trunk on the back side. but I don't think that's the right choice. I'm looking around the tree to see what there is to fill those holes. I have a branch above it off of the other trunk, and I have this branch below it. So we're going to go ahead and take the one that's crossing there out. Then as we look up in the top here, we got a lot going on. Take some of those out. This branch is up over top of the desired branches. That one and that smaller one. This crotch is small enough. Also, up in the top of the tree, I'm not as concerned about showing off that wider crotch. And then here, these guys are competing quite a bit. Remembering that I'm going to use the one behind it, and not that one. Potentially not that. Here's another one that's going straight up. We'll just go ahead and remove that. And then these two pieces here are really competing. So again, I want the tree to spread out. I'm going to go ahead and go slightly more laterally. We might be able to remove that piece as well. Just always look behind and see what branch is coming to replace that, either from the side or from the back. Yeah, and these funky parts out.
When you plant these trees, you plant them in the fall always?
You can, depends on, we like fall plantings, but you can plant any time of year as long as you're prepared to care for it. I mean, transplant shock can be pretty great at times, but we're often planting all the time. If we waited till the fall, we'd be really busy in the fall.
Yeah, we'd be jobless for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
To move a Japanese maple that's maybe a little bit younger than this, would the middle of next month be okay?
You want to do it now is perfect. You want to do it before, it's fine, before the leaves are, there's kind of a transitional time when the leaves are opening that we usually stay away from it, but if you're digging one, it's best when it's completely dormant. Next week could be good, this week.
Okay. Is that the same, John, for like if you have one in a pot right now and you want to...
Pot's okay, because you have 100% of the root system inside of that pot.
Okay.
So when we harvest one, we're going to be leaving some of the root system behind. So usually to compensate for that, we'll do some light pruning at the same time. But with a potted plant, typically we have 100% of the roots. The only problem is if it's been in the pot too long and it's pot bound, then we have to do some root sort of pruning. So then some top work would also be recommended. So I'll let Aaron finish that up. That's really about all we would do for now. There's a few more in the top and the back that just kind of like a big broom of growth. We want to sort of flatten and open that up a little bit so that we have some more space.
It just looks so much better.
Yeah.
It looks right away.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a genetically weeping tree. Japanese maples, there's a lot. There's both red and green cultivars, while this is not a weeping Japanese maple, it is a genetically weeping tree. This is a red bud in this case. That
Silver bells.
silver, oh, it's a Cyrax? Huh, well, still, genetically weeping. Technique's still the same. With genetically weeping trees, rather than taking the branch off of the top that's going to grow up and shade out the lower material, we're often taking the branch off of the bottom that's growing straight down. We want this to arch out as it goes. So if we look kind of closely here, you can see the bud on top arches out nicely, and the one on the bottom goes straight down. So that is the piece that we take out in an effort to get it to spread out. The same is true about dead branches and crossing branches. We want volume inside of the tree, but we also, the same situation is true. We don't want a big gnarly mess, which is what we have. This branch is on top. Generally, we would keep that, especially if it was in the apex of the tree, apex being the top of the tree, and I wanted the tree to be bigger, I would leave that. I want those, but here it's growing back to the inside. I'm going to remove it because it's got nowhere good to go. This branch you could leave, but just to make a point, I'm going to go ahead and take it for now. So my effort here is to try and relieve some congestion on the inside of the tree. These branches, many of them are already dead because they've been shaded out.
John, I have a question.
Yep.
On that tree.
Yep.
On the weeping trees, do you want the air to flow through them easier at the top?
We always, we want air and light for everything. That's what makes them grow. I mean, unless they're just incredibly shade tolerant, then eventually what happens if we don't thin them out is we just lose all that. And then we just have only growth out at the tip.
Speaking of shade, this one's obviously leaning because it's always shaded on one side.
Oh, we love that. So we are constantly looking for ways to put motion into trees. I mean, it's difficult when we have a lot of really straight trees like the pine trees. You know, we need other forms to complement that in the garden setting. We can't have all conical things like a magnolia or a holly or something like that. So when we have single trunk trees, you know, we often, especially in the Japanese garden context, are planting them at angles so that they look like they do in nature. Rarely, you know, do we see trees just growing absolutely straight. Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
Well, no, I did Cheryl's weeping tree and did it exactly the way he's doing that.
Oh, good for you.
And it really came out.
pushed out.
It really came out really well.
I have a Carolina jasmine that's kind of like this. Do you know what I'm talking about with all the, I would imagine you use the same kind of ideas for something like that.
It's a vine, isn't it?
It's a vine. It's a vine.
Cut it.
Well, I mean, it
Cut it.
comes, no,
Got it.
it's up on a stalk like this and it branches out. It looks like a tree, but it's a vine, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's part of the two main reasons that I'm pruning plants in the Garden of the Pine Wind is for size control and to make them more interesting. Depending upon what plant and where it is, that that ratio of interest to size control varies.
Whatever you.
That's what I do everywhere.
So this is a kind of a game time decision for you. If this were the apex of the tree, this one's on top, it's going quite a bit up. To me, it's breaking the line of branches that I've already kind of developed. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that. They're really hard to see, but we have a lot of repeating stuff. We have 2 branches coming out here, essentially doing the same thing.
And right above it.
Yeah, exactly. So start there. Then I'm going to look to these 2 here. This is a really, really strong.
But as you can see, what John has clipped out of there, the airflow is going to be much different from this.
There you go.
I know, don't cry over there, y'all. Calm down.
You know, the amazing thing is nobody notices if you don't,
If we're not watching.
you're not watching. That's right.
Now, and when that thing leaves out, it's going to be beautiful.
Yeah.
You're not even going to know. Just like that maple.
Well, what we're doing is beginning to, reveal the actual nature of the tree.
The beauty of it.
So that is essentially the idea. Now up here in the apex, I want to send it out. I want to keep this material in here alive as much as I possibly can.
Yeah.
This was a great idea to get them over here.
Thanks, Sandy Mirage. It was her idea. Thanks,
Well,
Sandy.
we'd like to show you what we're doing. Yeah, it's probably a little bit.
I think for me, the fear of cutting off too much, right? I mean, I'm looking around going, oh my gosh, I'd be having a heart attack right now.
Yeah.
But I guess
Well,
to make it healthier.
Yeah, that's why we start early, and it's better to do a little bit at a time when you can. The important thing is, understanding the right way to cut on material. As Aaron mentioned before, we never want to leave a stub like this. In trees that have what we call adventitious buds or dormant buds, we potentially would get growth right there. In some trees that don't typically do that, then this would die, like a pine tree. This would die back, and that's actually an area for infection. So we really want to cut back closer to the stem. When we cut the larger branches, though, we really want to make sure we get them in a good location. There's an area of tissue at the contact point called the branch collar, and that's where we like to make the cut. Not out here, not way back in here, not a flush cut. That would be really hard for the tree to callus. But somewhere in that area where the tissue, you can tell, is slightly different, it will speed the callus around that area. For me, with Japanese maples, I also don't like to make a series of cuts in a line all at one time, because I feel like it offers a higher potential for dieback and sun skull, both in the winter and in the summer. So had I taken that big one off, I probably would have left the smaller one in there in an effort to help keeping materials, keeping the transport along this side of the, cambium of the branch here, in an effort to callus that off. Sometimes that's why it's nice to be able to come back. For us, we are often sort of forced, to make our decisions a little bit quicker. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is show you a couple of maples in pot, and a couple of things to look for in the nursery if you're going to buy a new Japanese maple. Again, you need to, there's a lot of different cultivars. It's good to know what it is. So, our phones are amazing now. We can look up and see what these cultivars size they grow to. Not all of them are going to be these beautiful sort of natural specimens that we have out here at Garvin Woodland Gardens. A lot of them are, very compact. There's things like Skeeter's broom that looks exactly like a broom and is more about the collective nature of Japanese maples than I think the beautiful nature of Japanese maples. But regardless, if you see a tree that you like, a few things to look for inside the nursery. One thing is you want to make sure that it's been cared for pretty well in the nursery and didn't miss a watering cycle and doesn't have a substantial amount of dieback. This is easy to see in the summertime. If there's a bunch of scorched leaves on top of it, that means it got dry, and you can imagine that that's a stress factor that's going to weaken the tree. Oftentimes when that happens, you'll see a discoloration to the smaller branches, and they're actually dead. But maples can sometimes trick you. Here's one that looks discolored, but is covered in buds. The important thing, though, is that it is viable at the tips and on all of its branches. Don't worry too much if it's got some old leaves hanging on. It could have been a result of a frost and not of a dryness. So I mentioned before, container grown trees can pretty much plant any time of year. You can too with the ball and burlap trees, but if we're going to harvest a tree, if we're going to transplant a tree within our own garden, the best time to do it is in the dormant season. If you'll look at these, even here in late January, the buds are beginning to swell on this, and it won't be long. By probably the end of March, we'll have beautiful leaves emerging. Now, oftentimes, especially on young trees and trees sometimes that have gone through a stress factor, we will see a bunch of this, what's often called sucker type growth. A couple of things could be happening. These buds, these adventitious buds, could be sprouting from below the graft, where a special cultivar like the Bloodgood or Emperor One or something was grafted on top of just a rootstock. These buds could be growing from below the rootstock. The tree could have been stressed. It could have gotten dry, which is what I think probably happened to this tree. The top recovered fine. Everything's great up here, but at the same time, it made some other pieces in here. Either way, we typically remove these off of there. If there's a lot of them, and you see them all over the trunk and some of the larger branches, I probably would stay away from that tree. But a couple down on the bottom is not really a deal breaker. And typically we go ahead and prune those off, especially if they're coming from below the root. Then, as far as planting goes, we want to make sure that we respect the flare, the root flare when we plant. And we don't plant our trees too deep. This dogwood here, likely a natural guy, unplanted, you can see obvious root flare. A large loblolly pine there. Also, maybe, yeah, it's a loblolly. Also a nice root flare. We want to be able to see that. The thing Aaron and I see most within the landscape are trees that are planted too deep. So be cognizant of that. Then also consider what you can do with the tree. They don't always have to go in the ground perfectly straight the way you get them. And this is something that we constantly do inside the Garden of the Pine Wind, looking for ways to make the tree appear, you know, more natural and less manicured. So I think that's it. Unless there are some other questions, we'll get back to work.